actually the entire global security there is. The world is changing. That is the world that quite recently was believed to be fairly homogeneous and globalized, following some more or less common rules and laws. Not everyone shared those rules and laws, but the fact was that those laws and rules dominated. Nobody disputed that. But that was just recently, and today it is not so anymore, because the world is changing. It is transforming into something much more diverse, heterogeneous, and non-linear structure. And regional aspects of security are the security. And at the same time, the rules of the game, the rules of behavior, are undergoing some very challenging times, because the institutes that we inherited from the 20th century, they do not seem to work to the full extent, and sometimes they are askew. But there are no new security institutes that would take into consideration this infinite diversity of today's world, economic, cultural, political. And when I talk about cultural, it's not just the entertainment kind of culture. I'm talking about the culture of thinking, political culture, strategic culture. That has not been created. And this is something that we will have to be working on creating over the next years and decades. And what is especially important, and that is really related to our today's discussion, is that these new institutions and new rules and principles will be built upon a very broad foundation. All these different diverse cultures that seem to be peripheral, subordinated to some central idea that was essentially emanated by the West. This no longer is the case. The West remains a very powerful international player, but it's not the only player anymore, and it's gradually losing its position because the world is getting really different. It is my pleasure that at today's plenary session we have not just distinguished and eminent experts from various countries, but they also represent those strategic cultures that are going to largely define how the world is going to be looking quite soon. And I think that there couldn't be a better finishing touch to this forum. Once again, thank you for the organizers for this. And I would like to give the floor first to our dear guest, Minister of Defense of China, Colonel General Wei Fenghe, not just because he's sitting next to me, but primarily because today, without a discussion about China, you cannot really have anything, any discussion, any world topic. No matter what topic you're talking about, the first thing that comes to mind is China. We are really happy about this because China is our reliable friend, partner, and a long comrade, and therefore I would like to give Mr. Wei Fenghe the first floor. Thank you, Mr. Lukyanov. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I'm really happy to attend the Moscow Conference on International Security for the second time in a row. First of all, I would like to meet my friends in Moscow, and I would like to thank Minister Sergei Shoigu for his kind invitation and the Russian side for their hospitality. I'm convinced that with concerted efforts of all, we're going to have a successful conference. Now, first of all, the world is undergoing profound changes unseen in a century, and the historical trend of peace and development is irresistible. The world today is going through a new round of great development, changes, and major adjustments. Human society is at a crossroads of crucial choices on our future, where to go. Peace and development remain the themes of the times. The only correct choice is to follow and ride on this historical trend and grab onto this trend. First, or rather secondly, we should stay committed to multilateralism and oppose unilateralism. Multipolarity and globalization have become irreversible trends. Countries are more and more interdependent, and no one can retreat into self-isolation. Facts have proved that unilateralism would only lead to monotonicity and imbalance, while only by upholding multilateralism could we build a diversified and balanced world. At this juncture, anti-globalization and protectionism are on the rise. Some countries adopt protectionist approach proactively in pursuit of the maximization of their own interest. This runs counter to the historical trend of development and is not echoed by countries of the world. We should also uphold fairness and justice and oppose power politics. China stands for the equality of all countries, whether strong or weak, rich or poor. We are against big countries bullying small countries and the strong bullying the weak. We oppose the practice of meddling regional issues and making troubles everywhere in the world. We oppose using religions and human rights to vilify other countries. We are against the wanton interference in other countries' internal affairs and the infringement of other sovereign rights and interests. The Taiwan question is an internal affair of China, and Taiwan independence is a historical countercurrent. No one should even think about playing the Taiwan card to coerce China and blackmail China. China must be and will be reunified. We will strive for peaceful reunification with the utmost sincerity and greatest efforts. If anyone attempted to separate Taiwan from China, the Chinese military will have no choice but to act decisively to safeguard national unity at all costs. Thirdly, we should stay committed to the kind of win-win cooperation and stand against zero-sum game. It is not cooperation when one party loses and the other wins. Only mutually beneficial relationship can last. China advocates a new concept of win-win and multi-win outcomes and opposes old mentalities of me first and winner takes all. At the end of the day, people will tell right from the wrong and have a fair judgment on things we do. We see that some countries bring high-speed rail, bridges, and prosperity, while some other countries bring only chaos. The latter ones pursue their own development at the cost of other countries' interests. They willfully withdraw from international treaties and organizations and impose sanctions on others.
For their own security, they sacrifice others' interests. This is absolutely immoral and could not be continued. Fourth, we should stay committed to dialogue and consultation and oppose the use of force. There is no winner in modern wars. It is especially true for the big powers, since they can hardly obtain complete compliance with the other side in the battlefield. Peace benefits both sides while fighting hurts us. We are opposed to the cohesion by force and big stick policies in international affairs. Some countries provoke disputes to push for their own agendas. They start wars at will and withdraw without fulfilling their responsibility and honoring their commitments, what led to the rise of Islamic State, the spread of terrorism, the chaos in the Middle East and North Africa, and massive number of refugees. What are the root causes? What should all look into the questions and make joint efforts in response? As people of all countries aspire for a better life. Building a community with a shared future for mankind is a pure path to realize our common dream. There is but one earth for human beings. All countries live in one world, the one and only global village. Great truths are always simple. The vision of building a community with a shared future for mankind put forward by President Xi Jinping closely connects the Chinese dream with the dreams of people around the world and has received profound international support. Guided by this vision, China is bringing the benefits of its own development to people of all countries. First, we should pursue mutually beneficial and win-win outcomes in development. China cannot develop in isolation from the rest of the world, and the world needs China for its prosperity. China puts justice first and honors its commitments in international cooperation. We uphold friendship and pursue shared interest and welcome more countries aboard the express of China's development. China's contribution to world economy has surpassed 30%. For years, the Belt and Road Initiative has brought tangible benefits to people of countries along the routes and is an important contribution to multilateralism and international peace. We will continue to follow the principle of pursuing shared benefits through extensive consultation and joint contribution and work with other countries to make the pie bigger so as to achieve common developments and prosperity. Second, we should shoulder responsibilities together in global governance. Every country should shoulder its responsibilities and fulfill its obligations. China is firmly committed to fulfilling its international obligation. It stays determined to build world peace, contribute to global prosperity, and uphold the international order. China promotes the reform of the global governance system for interests of the majority of countries. We will continue to provide China's approach and wisdom and contribute China's strength in addressing global climate change. Third, we should work hand in hand to safeguard security. China will continue to work with countries of the world to build a security architecture featuring joint contribution and shared benefits. China is committed to protecting openness and security of strategic passages in southern China Sea and maintaining peace and stability together with ASEAN countries. Important progress has been made in consultation of the COC, and the China-ASEAN maritime exercise was successfully held last year. China stays committed to peaceful development and dialogue and consultations to properly handle territorial and sovereignty disputes with neighboring countries. China's development is by no means a threat to any country. China will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion, no matter how strong it becomes. Never will pursue the policy of expansion. Facing complex and demanding security challenges, Chinese armed forces remain a staunch force of peace in Asia and the world. No country can stand alone from security threats, challenges in the world, nor can we fight them alone. We should uphold the new concept of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security and seek peace and security through cooperation. First, we should build a new type of military relationship. The armed forces of all countries should have more strategic communication, improved dialogue mechanisms, and strengthened coordination and cooperation. At present, the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination is developing at high level, and the military relations between the two countries are becoming more deepened and practical. China-Russia military-to-military relations relationship has become an example of non-confrontational cooperation that is not based on alliance or targeting a third. The two sides will promote cooperation. China enhance the ability to jointly respond to threats and challenges, to enhance the capabilities. This morning, to gain with the Minister Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, exchange our opinions and achieved mutual understanding. The China-U.S. relationship is moving forward despite ups and downs. We hope the U.S. side can work together with the Chinese side towards the same goal, manage differences on the basis of mutual respect, inspire mutually beneficial cooperation, and jointly advance a relationship featuring coordination, cooperation, and steady development. The two between two armies to effectively manage crises and other differences. China places great importance on developing new type of military relations with the regional countries and is willing to conduct extensive practical cooperation with them to jointly build a stable regional security environment. Second, we should actively assume international responsibilities. The armed forces of all countries should actively fulfill their international obligations, strengthen cooperation in international peacekeeping, humanitarian aid and disaster relief, mine-sweeping, chemical protection assistance, and provide more public security goods. In particular, we should step up joint counter-terrorism effort and deepen practical cooperation and intelligence exchange, personnel training, and joint exercises. China has set up a peacekeeping standby force of 8,000 troops. We will continue to send naval vessels to the Gulf of Aden and the waters of coast of Somalia for vessel protection missions, join overseas HADR operations, and actively participate in UN peacekeeping operations. In the spirit of mutual benefit, openness, and exclusivity, the armed forces of all countries should actively explore such security cooperation mechanisms as counter-terrorism coordination, joint exercises, dialogues between Defense Department and border defense talks, to push forward to create frameworks of universally accepted architecture. China has promoted to establish a counter-terrorism cooperation and coordination mechanism. We a part of mechanism of SCO, and I invite all heads of the defense ministers, specialists, and scientists to take part in the 9th Senshan, which will be held in Beijing in October this year. Thank you very much to everybody.
Большое спасибо, господин министр.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for a very comprehensive description of Chinese leadership. And as always, the presentation of Chinese colleagues is very descriptive, and the wording which was used to join the movement of train, which goes from China to the rest of the world, and everybody is invited to join this movement. Of course, in Russia, with our mentality, we are very happy that justice lives in the soul of every individual, and we believe that the ideas of justice and fair approach is part of the Russian soul, and we believe that Chinese also share this understanding. We will continue to be present in Asia, and our dear guest, Senior Minister, Mr. Mr. Heng's speech.
Thank you to our moderator, Mr. Lukyanov, for a very kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I would first like to thank Minister Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation for the invitation to Singapore to be part of the 8th Moscow Conference on International Security. This is the 4th time that Singapore is participating in this conference, and I'm pleased to speak alongside a distinguished panel and be able to share Singapore's perspective on security arrangements in the Asia-Pacific. The system of multilateralism, which emerged after the end of the Second World War and evolved into what it is today after the Cold War, has benefited all countries, big and small. So allow me to highlight 4 key features of this multilateral order that stand out. First, globalization and economic liberalization have brought prosperity to all countries, even as we enhance the distribution of the gains of trade. The reduction of trade barriers through successive rounds of tariff negotiations have fostered a favorable business environment that is conducive to the growth of exports and investments and the flow of skilled personnel and technologies. It is notable that the value of global exports in the year 2014, adjusted for constant prices, was more than 50 times that prior to the First World War, that is compared to the year 1919, and more than 52 times that after the Second World War, measured against the year 1950. Second, the free movement of people and goods made possible by improvements in travel and transport has supported the increase in world trade. Compared to the year 1990, the cost of sea freight has fallen by 5 times by the year 2005, while passenger air transport costs fell even more by 10 times. At the same time, the number of tourists worldwide increased exponentially from 25 million in the year 1950 to 1.2 billion in the year 2016. This represents an almost 50-fold increase. Third, closer collaboration and interactions across geographies have accelerated technological innovation. Today, we are on the cusp of commercial adoption of 5G technology. We are talking about speeds of up to 20 gigabits per second, which is a 10 million-fold increase from the speed of the first generation technology. Earlier this month, the Republic of Korea and the United States were the first 2 countries to roll out their commercial 5G networks, and we believe that many more countries are expected to do so very quickly. Fourth, we have witnessed the proliferation of a host of international and regional institutions, and these institutions have established rules and norms to manage and govern interstate and cross-border interactions on trade and security. They include, and are not limited to, the United Nations, the G20, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was succeeded by the WTO. The Asia-Pacific is one region that has benefited tremendously from multilateralism and open market economies. Many of the countries in the region, which were economically crippled or devastated after the Second World War, are today some of the most dynamic and prosperous economies in the world. At the same time, ASEAN and its associated mechanisms have helped to forge a stable regional architecture which has promoted dialogue and cooperation. This stable external regional environment has provided conditions for countries to continue to enjoy peace and prosperity. However, the spirit of multilateralism is now being challenged by 2 points of tension. First, a wave of protectionist and isolationist sentiment has emerged, born out of the unhappiness that economic globalization, a key outcome of the multilateral trade regime, has unevenly benefited certain countries and peoples, thereby creating winners and losers. The growth in conservative anti-globalization and anti-immigration sentiment sweeping across North America, Europe, and in parts of the Asia-Pacific can be seen as an acute reaction to economic globalization. These trends challenge the fundamental tenets of the current system and multilateralism as a whole. A more radical and deformed outgrowth of this protest against globalization is in the observed increase in xenophobia and racism in many countries. This has already fueled extremist and terrorist acts throughout the world, including the tragic Easter bombing of churches in Sri Lanka just a few days ago, and the shocking terrorist attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand last month. In Singapore, we are also cognizant of the threat of returning fighters from the Middle East following the defeat of ISIS. From our vantage point as a global maritime hub, which is reliant on international trade, and a multiracial and multi-ethnic country, these trends pose a particular and significant challenge to our security. Second, strategic rivalry between the United States and China risks spilling over into overt competition, which create costs and challenges for individual states and the region at large. The post-Cold War period, which witnessed the West's attempts to integrate China and members of the former Soviet bloc into the prevailing international system. China's accession to the WTO in 2001 was a watershed moment. Russia's accession in 2012 was another. However, this reflected an extraordinary state of affairs, and the honeymoon period appears to be over. We are now seeing signs of a return to the great power rivalry that has defined the most part of our modern international system. Let me turn to the implications of this on the Asia-Pacific, where the effects are likely to be very keenly felt. Fundamental points of tension between the United States and China, which are not entirely new, have surfaced. We are on the brink of open competition, particularly in trade and technology spheres. This poses two key challenges for the region and the standing multilateral order. First, more countries may be pulled in positions where they have to choose sides, whether deliberately or as an inadvertent and unfortunate outcome. For countries that do not have indigenous capabilities, the choice of network provider to supply 5G technology, for example, increasingly looks to be one area where they may be forced to choose. Such zero-sum approaches pose hard choices for regional states. Second, ongoing trade tensions between the United States and China have already slowed regional economic activity. Factory activity and export orders across the region, including Malaysia, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, have all slipped at the onset of the trade tensions. The ongoing trade tensions also appeared to have harmed the US and China's own economies. China's factory activity reportedly fell for 4 months from November 2018 to a 4-year low in February 2019, while unemployment rose to a 2-year high. Estimates also suggest that the United States has forgone roughly $17 billion worth of exports to China in the 5 months from July to November 2018 due to its increased and imposed tariffs. If left unchecked, these trends could lead countries to be more inward-looking and produce beggar-thy-neighbor outcomes. And in the worst case, we could see a divided region. Ladies and gentlemen, the tensions that I've highlighted have already generated costs and risk undermining regional stability in the longer run. Multilateralism can thus be said to be at the crossroads. From Singapore's perspective, it is essential that all players work together to arrive at a new equilibrium. This necessarily involves give and take on all sides. While it may be difficult, we must do it and avoid a return to the pre-World War II system of bilateralism or the Cold War era bifurcation of global politics. As we search for this new equilibrium, it is essential that all sides find ways to manage disputes and prevent them from escalating. While some competition is to be expected between great powers, conflict is not inevitable. Let me offer two suggestions on how defense ministries and militaries in our region can directly strengthen multilateralism for our collective peace and development. First, maintaining strong military-to-military cooperation and communication is essential to building trust. Communication and a degree of trust between military establishments are essential in averting crisis and countering escalatory narratives. For instance, we witnessed the meeting between the then US Secretary of Defense James Mattis and China's Minister for National Defense, General Wei, who is here with us today, on the sideline last year of the ASEAN Defense Minister Meetings Plus, so the ADMM Plus meeting that was held in Singapore in October last year, where both sides reaffirmed the importance of dialogue, risk reduction, maintaining open lines of communication between both militaries. This sent a strong signal of assurance to the rest of the region and countered the pessimistic narrative which arose after decisions to cancel several high-level interactions were made in the preceding weeks of that meeting. Such exchanges are important and contribute to stable bilateral and regional relations. Second, we must shore up regional security institutions such as the ADMM Plus, in which Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States are participating members alongside the 10 ASEAN states. Such institutions provide important platforms to foster practical cooperation amongst member states, to engage in dialogue, and to build trust. We have already witnessed concrete successes. The 10 ASEAN member states adopted the Guidelines for Air Military Encounters, GAME or GAME, in October 2018 on the sidelines of the ADMM meeting. This represents the world's first set of multilateral air guidelines which can serve to prevent disastrous consequences that may result from unplanned encounters between military aircraft. GAME complements the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, CUES or CUES, that was already adopted by all ADMM Plus countries. And we will exercise CUES in the upcoming ADMM Plus Maritime Security Exercise to be held in the Republic of Korea and Singapore this month and in May, respectively. The ADMM Plus Experts Working Group, or EWG system, also provides opportunities for member militaries to enhance practical cooperation and sharing. We have found a system of partnering an ASEAN state with a Plus member to drive collaboration in 7 specific areas to be very useful. There are now EWGs for counterterrorism, cybersecurity, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, humanitarian mine action, maritime security, military medicine, and peacekeeping operations. There is an urgent need for multilateralism to adapt to the changing realities, and for all parties to seek and to arrive at a new equilibrium. The alternative to that is isolationism, protectionism, and strategic rivalry. We must not repeat past mistakes, and there is now much for all of us to do, and in getting it wrong, there is much for all of us to lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. You've just raised a very important topic, and it was the same topic that was raised by General Wei Fenghe in his speech when he spoke about the economic aspects of security. It is not really common to quote from the classics of Marxism-Leninism here, but we should remember that heritage. And I remember from my student years the article written by Lenin, Imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, where he analyzes the reasons for large-scale conflicts as the result of very acute competition, economic competition of major powers. Nothing really has changed since then, and therefore, in today's world, everything is interrelated, and that can generate military conflicts, and we hope that none of that is going to happen, as the things that both speakers mentioned will help prevent that. I would like to thank Minister Heng for being here, because he needs to be on his way to the airport, but thank you very much for joining us when we hope to see you next year. Thank you. In the very first speech by our Chinese colleague, we heard a very interesting image of that juxtaposed monotonicity and disbalance. And the balance that brings us the polycentric world. And the next speaker is the Vice Admiral, Mr. Kostikov, the head of the Chief Department of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Russia. Hopefully you're going to talk about the multicolor aspect of this world. Hopefully you know more about it than any one of us, and maybe you are going to be the judge of it. Thank you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, Latin America is a dynamically developing region uniting 33 countries with a population of over 600 million people. It's a very rich, resource-rich region, but there are a number of characteristic problems that are typical for this region as far as security goes. That includes instability, political instability in some countries, high dependence of most of Latin American countries on the United States and the West in general, and the financial structure that is controlled by the United States. Growing competition between non-regional players for access to the natural resources of Latin America, lack of regulation for or unsettled territorial disputes, the presence of militants, illegal and unlawful militants, and a very serious crime situation in many countries, drug trafficking and drug mafia. That's where 98% of cocaine in the world is produced. There's a lot of illegal arms trafficking and other explosive substances. As for the new factors of risk, I would like to mention that there are camps for training jihadists. On the territory of Latin American countries, we've seen some Islamic extremists that are affiliated with the terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. That's where they recruit militants to fulfill their ranks in the Middle East and in Africa. And that is where they impose the nationalist ideology. And that concerns a lot of Muslims in the region. With a lot of challenges in the region itself, the United States presents the biggest challenge in terms of its security. Trying to preserve its global dominance, the United States has taken measures to beef up its influence on the Latin American countries, and it's using the entire arsenal of political and financial, economic, and force levers. And for that reason, the United States is drawing the local countries into the cooperation with NATO. Colombia got the status of a partner of NATO in March of 2019. Donald Trump said that Brazil may be granted a similar status. Despite the fact that Latin America doesn't present any threat to the United States security, the United States has significant forces deployed there. The Joint Command of the United States counts up to 20,000 people in Latin America, and this number is expected to increase to 40,000. Directly in Latin America, there are permanently deployed tactical groups of the Air Force with the number of 7,500 people. The Pentagon has been developing plans for creating a multinational unit that would be made of United States Navy ships, and they are involving Latin American countries into the international training exercises. With the coming of Donald Trump to the White House, the U.S. administration took the course toward the aggressive promotion of the U.S. interests. The following goals are being tried to achieve: to have total control over all global political processes, ensure that the United States continues dominating in the developing markets, and have essentially unrestricted access to natural resources, and essentially be in the way of the development of the BRICS countries and stand in the way of Russia's cooperation with Western countries, and try to squeeze not just Russia and China from international markets, but also the EU. The meddling in the affairs of the countries in the region, they have expanded the circle of those elites that want to be on their side. And at the moment, the United States, the White House, has turned the Organization of American States into a tool for fighting dissidents in the region to promote their own interests. Using the Lima Group as an example, we can see that there is a very clear and dangerous trend to try to create an informal structure that would be controlled by the United States. Their activities are not guided by any norms or standards, which makes these groups very useful to make decisions that would be really dubious from the standpoint of international law. By following the Monroe Doctrine, the United States are actively participating in interfering with types of supports that some of the Latin countries may be getting, trying to promote their interests in the region. And that includes applying pressures on the countries that they find to be rogue states. Let me give you a few examples. In 2017, they contributed to stopping Venezuela's participation in the American common market, formerly on the assistance of Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil. In accordance with the U.S. national strategy, defense strategy, they want to beef up their power component, and that is something that drives the regime change. In February of this year, on the 18th, Donald Trump made a goal of changing regimes in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. As they believe in Washington, this will allow them, the United States, to reformat Latin America and make it into a zone that will be fully under control of the United States. And attempts are being made regarding Venezuela to destabilize the situation in the country by inciting opposition forces, by igniting massive protests, and what's important, starting a hybrid aggression against this nation. And they are trying to create inside Venezuela parallel governance agencies, including the recognition of Juan Guaido as the interim president of the country. That also means accreditation of alternative ambassadors to other countries and its representatives to international organizations. It's the seizure of diplomatic property and other property abroad, seizing and freezing accounts, imposition of sanctions, and massive economic and political pressure. The Guaido candidature was chosen from a longer list of the opposition members, which means that he's going to play an expendable role just to change the regime. And speaking about the implementation of color revolutions, the United States are using this mechanism by using Lima, the European Union, and other international and financial organizations as tools of this policy. They implement plans that would stop the activities of regional structures, primarily the Union of South American countries, and instead they created a new organization called the Forum for Progress in South America, which is supposed to promote regional interests of the United States. Under the U.S. pressure, the U.S. or Inter-American Development Bank demonstrably stopped in March the meeting in China because Beijing didn't give the visa to someone who was appointed by Guaido. With Washington's, or at the Washington's bidding, they are giving Guaido a credit of $50 billion to restore the economy. And they say that this is something that will promote foreign partners of Caracas to stop them interacting with this activity. They're continuing to suffocate Venezuela, and because new sectoral sanctions were introduced, oil, which is the main source for the budget of Venezuela, the budget shrunk by one-half, and they were deprived of about $1 billion. In addition to the main donor of the Venezuela economy, the petroleum company of Venezuela, they took the actives and the assets of many strategic companies of the company, and the UK banks are not returning 80 tons of Venezuela's gold to the country. In February, there was an attempt to make a humanitarian intervention into Venezuela to provoke mass protests and to make the government use police and law enforcement. But this blitzkrieg against Venezuela didn't succeed. Washington miscalculated how strong is the legitimate government of the country, how supportive the population is, and whether its armed forces are ready to protect the country. And their bet on essentially conflict between the army and the people didn't materialize. But the undermining activity, the underhand dealing of the United States continues. They are developing various types of methods to remove the government, and they are developing various systems to provoke a civilian explosion, so to speak. And the Washington is not going to use its own armed forces. They want to organize the intervention using the hands of its allies, primarily Colombia. And they are encouraging militant groups made up of Venezuela's deserters and various other groups from Latin America and insurgents from Colombia that are already being used in order to perform acts of sabotage in Venezuela. And the Americans are not disturbed by the fact that their activities really hurt common people, ordinary people, and they claim that they stand to protect their interests. And Washington is nearly ready to announce Venezuela the sponsor of international terrorism and take forceful measures against Caracas. And the technologies of color revolutions that are being tried in Venezuela are soon may be applied to Nicaragua. That is sponsored by the United States is essentially stopping the dialogue that is nearly beginning in the country, and to dismantle the Cuban government. The Trump administration decided to use economic measures. In March, they reinstated the use of the U.S. federal law, the Helms-Burton law, that allows Americans to demand a redemption of their lost interest in Cuban assets. Another blow on Cuba was the reduction of Venezuelan oil to the island. And to increase their influence on an annual basis. The State Department of the United States spends up to $1.5 billion. And that's just the official data, without taking into consideration other extra budgetary programs.
So the U.S. administration considers Latin America the zone of their national interests, and they spend a lot of efforts to ensure absolute control over this region. They infringe the laws of international community, and they sacrifice the stability and the American centralized national policy is the major threat to the countries of Latin America. As a result of this destabilizing activity of Washington could be properly assessed in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and Libya. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Igor Olegovich, for such a detailed description of the situation in Latin America, and this is one of the topics of our session. We'll get back to Venezuela a little later, and I understand President Trump, if I'm not mistaken, when Sonara was in Washington and suggested that Brazil joins NATO. It was a kind of an approach of understanding what NATO is. And I am specifically happy to welcome at our conference Minister of People's Won Jibang-ho, General, because North Korea is in the center of attention, and it is very important for us to see what Pyongyang thinks, and today is a very important day. In Vladivostok, there was a summit between President Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and that is their first meeting, and so much is being said about this, and on a regional and on a global level. So we are very happy to welcome you, Mr. Choi.
참석한 여러 나라 국방상들과 국제기구, 비정부단체 대표 선생들과 대표단 성원.
Allow me to welcome all participants of the conference and organizers.
국제 안전에 관한 모스크바 토론에 초청하고 따뜻이 환대하여 주고 있는
I would like to say, for me, it's a great honor to participate in this conference. And on behalf of the Defense Ministry, I express to our colleagues from the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation our thanks for a very warm reception. And allow me to brief you on principles of People's Republic of Korea to maintain peace and security in the Korean Peninsula and in the region. In recent years, political situation around the world was very complicated. In many countries, the vicious circle of terrorism and retaliation brought about never-ending bloodshed, and in hot points, and we see very horrible pictures. And today, the policy actually brings to the violation of sovereignty. The humanity is looking for justice peace, and the situation on the Korean Peninsula only exacerbated the security of the region and affected global security. Since last year, a lot of changes took place, and the atmosphere of chronic mistrust started to change towards the direction of appeasement and cooperation. The whole world witnessed a series of events took place beyond all expectations. On the Korean Peninsula, where the danger of war lingered in the utmost extremes of acute confrontation and distrust, they gave rise to the warm atmosphere of dialogue and cooperation, thus opening a new phase of national reconciliation and unity for peace and prosperity, thanks to the bold decision of Comrade Kim Jong-un, chairman of the State Affairs Commission, who has noble patriotism and firm determination to ensure peace. The historic inter-Korean summits and talks were held one after another, adopted Panmunjom Declaration, September Pyongyang Declaration, Joint Declaration, and the military agreement to implement Panmunjom Declaration. These historic events reflect the firm resolve that will remove the danger of war and establish a durable peace mechanism to usher in the era of peace in which war exists no longer on the Korean Peninsula. They are of great significance as a historic milestone to put an end to confrontation and distress and signal a new start of peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. And last year, the historic first DPRK-US summit and talks were held in Singapore, attracting the whole world attention, in which were adopted the June 12th DPRK-US joint statement. It was a historic occasion of epochal significance in bringing about a change, as clarified in the historic DPRK-US joint statement, have already taken series of proactive and preemptive practical measures with its unwavering stand to build a lasting and stable peace. In the New Year address, Comrade Kim Jong-un, chairman of the State Affairs Commission, reviewed the priceless achievement made in the inter-Korean and DPRK-US relations for peaceful prosperity on the Korean Peninsula, and its firm government steadfast position to eradicate military hostility in Korea and to adhere to the Inter-Korean Declaration that will make to change the situation which characterizes the military confrontation and to open the epoch of lasting peace. For Korean nation, which suffered tremendous losses during the misery of war, and it is a matter of survival, and the government of DPRK spent a lot of efforts to achieve its goals. And the history of Korea, which was full of different shocks, when guns are firing, you cannot establish reliable dialogue, and any efforts to peace and prosperity will be useless. If we want to repeat those ugly moments of the past, we need to preserve the atmosphere of trust and appeasement and reconciliation created with much effort to support this atmosphere and to prepare conditions for peace and prosperity. For that, all those positive steps which were made to eliminate military antagonism should be extrapolated through the whole territory of Korea, and the joint exercises with foreign countries, and speaking about the ceasefire conditions, we need to develop the situation of truce to the situation of complete peace. And that's going to be the first step, which will be a prerequisite of peace and will eliminate the threat of a nuclear confrontation. So if the sides would move forward, just approach and will demonstrate the will, they will definitely achieve very good results in providing peace and security. Korean Peninsula is a small part of the Asian Pacific region, but a lot is dependent on this situation, and we see this political situation of a separately taken country influences a lot on the situation of the region, and all the forces which would like
the United States should implement the articles of the June 12 DPRK-US joint statement with sincerity, keeping pace with the aspiration of the humankind for peace, prosperity, and development of the world. The U.S. would be greatly mistaken if we thought that sanctions can bring us to our knees. It is well advised to know that sanctions cannot be helpful in solving issues. As Chairman Kim Jong-un of the State Affairs Commission declared in his historic policy speech, we hope that the second hand of the clock of the DPRK-US showdown, which they stopped with so much difficulty, will not move again for all ages. The DPRK shall lead the current state of détente, hardly achieved, into stable peace and maintain closer relations and cooperation with the international society with the idea of independence, peace, and friendship, so as to fulfill its obligation and role of keeping global peace and security. And we look forward to give support and encouragement to DPRK's efforts to build a lasting and durable peace mechanism in the Korean Peninsula. Finally, I once again appreciate the commitments of the leadership and defense ministry of the Russian Federation to global peace and security by hosting this Grand Security Forum and facilitating open-minded and constructive dialogue on the international security issue. And I look forward to great success on this conference true to its purpose of promoting the peace and security of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General No. What you said is very important for us to hear from such a high-ranking leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This appeal for peace and stability. We really have to say that over the last 18 months, things have changed a lot. And despite the fact that new problems arise, the thrust is different. And as General Wei said in his first speech, we need to and want to believe that this drive toward peace is taking lead.
We are coming back to Latin America, and I'm very happy to welcome at this session the Senior General Pascualina Fernandez, the General Secretary of the Council of Defense of Venezuela. The country is in the center of international attention, and actually we are very happy how it is perceived right at the spot. The floor is yours. Good afternoon. Before we start, I would like to convey welcome to the participants of our plenary session, and I'd like to welcome Mr. Lukyanov, who is brilliantly moderating our meeting, and I warmly welcome ministers, Igor Olegovich, Deputy Head of the General Staff of Russian Federation, who very truthfully depicted and described the situation in Latin America, and esteemed ministers, men and women who are participating in this work of this forum. And I thank also Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu, General of the Army, and all those who organized this forum. We thank that on behalf of Venezuela delegation, and I also convey welcomes and wishes of peace on behalf of the Bolivarian Republic, Nicolas Maduro, and on behalf of our Venezuela people from the members of the armed forces who are struggling for peace. As we all know, the specialists in military issues, that despite the lack of resources, we saw that the basic reasons of conflicts, and there are several reasons, but today we see how these conflicts are aggravated, and I would like to give you some information on oil production in the world. In 2015, 90.5 millions of oil were produced a day, and the demand for the manufacturing of oil on a global level exceeded 95.7 million barrels a day. We were talking about the lack of 5.2 million barrels a day. That creates a disbalance, and this is the reality with the oil resources. Could be attributed to such vital resources as natural gas, mineral resources like potable water, and other products of biodiversity. And the United States and their allies, in order to ensure control and access to these resources of the planet, they continuously develop military doctrines which violate peace and international security, and our conference is dedicated to that. From the viewpoint of Venezuela, we, as victims, could remind some things about these doctrines. The theory of strategic reconnaissance, which was developed by Sherman Kent, the author about strategic reconnaissance or strategic intelligence, collection of information, its processing, and the use when decision-making could ensure achievements of the goals, imperialistic goals, and this is the real policy. Or the theory of the so-called rogue states, which is used in the mass media in order to prove that those states where America has some strategic interest, they talk that these states are rogue states and there are different variants of their own. And we know about the doctrine of legitimate defense or fair war. These are the variants of the so-called theory or responsibility for defense. And the purpose is the elaboration of media standpoint, which says that the standard of living is not adequate for the population, and so using this humanitarian point, they justify the aggression or intervention into this country. That was said by the deputy head of the General Staff of Russian Federation, who said that even import of pharmaceuticals and foodstuffs is made very difficult. And you may also read in the books of Joseph Nye the sanctions, the boycott and blockade. This is the tough force, and soft force is various kinds of help and loans. And Lima Group, about which the Vice Admiral spoke, the American Congress supports this group, and they also have plans for intervention, or the theory of constructive chaos, which was developed by Zbigniew Brzezinski, politologist, speaks about manipulation of different tools, which make it difficult for the government to operate, and that was used against Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela when our electric generating company was affected in March of 2019, and that led to serious difficulties for our citizens. Or even one more theory about the so-called failed state, which was developed by Jen Sharp, and he speaks about nonviolent policy or about some so-called soft strikes
against those governments that are not to the liking of the United States. Now I'd like to talk about why did Venezuela became in the center of this multifaceted war, and what is the real reason for the conflict. As you know really well, and this has been mentioned many times, our country in the Western Hemisphere where we are has a wealth of natural resources, including oil reserves, more than 300 billion barrels worth of oil. In addition, we are ranked really high in terms of our deposits of hydrocarbons, such as natural gas. We have more than 200 trillion cubic meters of gas. That's our reserves. Venezuela, in the Bolivar states, we have an ore belt, which is or streak. It has the square area of more than 120 square kilometers, 1,000 kilometers. It's more than Portugal or the Dominican Republic size-wise. In the region, we have huge deposits of gold, diamonds, and other strategically important natural resources. Our country is also characterized by the fact that we are very close to the empire, the United States, who would really want to rule our country. And of course, that is the reason why the United States is against Venezuela being part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and that it has contacts and ties with the Chinese People's Republic and with Russia and with other fraternal nations such as Cuba and Bolivia. And these are our fraternal countries that we have very good relations with, that are sovereign relations, and that is why I'm asking myself this question. What can we do to guarantee peace and international security? I think this is one of the most important goals of this conference, and it seems to me that a moment has come for us to start creating blocks of reasonable states, sane states, that would respect basic principles of international relations on the planet. I think that it is also time to make use of our sense of reason and mutual respect to help our peoples respectively. The international economic situation asks us to build new geopolitics to establish peace and balance in the world. That's not the geopolitics we studied in the school. That was the politics of domineering. We remember those teachers that told us that those who owns the center of the territory owns the periphery, and those who own the seas own the entire world. No, we look at this differently in Venezuela, and our founding father, Simón Bolívar, spoke about a different policy aimed at ensuring peace and stability. Starting with the historic independence congresses, we have kept our mind on this. We remember this. We are fighting for international security, and we thank you for inviting us to this conference. We would like to thank you all for participating. This is a major contribution to ensuring peace and security in the world. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. As an expert, as a member of the experts community, I am really flattered by the fact that some of my colleagues have been ascribed this very intricate concepts that start, making that much effect on the international arena. It seems to me, being on the inside, that the intellectual might of us, of experts, is not really that huge, although indeed some of those ideas and concepts do have the right fit with the interests of the major powers, large players, and become instrumentally useful to some. They have certain utility. But I don't really believe in this theory of constructive chaos. The destructive chaos is something that we see quite a lot of, and it's not really working for those that think that they can ensure that there is constructive chaos to do that. But I would like to point out that it is very important to consider that that idea that was expressed by our Venezuelan colleague, that we need to create a bloc of reasonable states. I would expand that a little bit. I think we need a bloc of reasonable people in addition to this, because it seems to me that madness is spreading around the world with huge speed. And if we don't do something to stop this, the laws of chaos and showbiz will prevail. And therefore, reasonable people and states need to hasten to make that happen. And I'm going back to Asia, which is quite close to Russia, and I would like to give the floor to our guest from Laos, the Minister of Defense, Tiansanmon Tiandanlat, Colonel General.
Mr. To invite me and my team to attend the 8th Moscow Conference on International Security, which is one of the most important conferences in the region and the world. It is the 4th time that the government of Laos has allowed me to attend this conference. Every time I join this event, I have a great opportunity to listen to the exchange of viewpoints and comments from many participants, which is the advantage for all people to contribute to enhancing the cooperation of international and regional security regarding the current situation and future. This also creates an opportunity for participating countries to discuss with each other and find better ways of how to solve the hot security issues in the new era. Meanwhile, the cooperative mechanism regarding coordination have been created more. Coordination have been created more effectively and suitably for many countries aiming the peaceful situation. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, the topic that I'm going to share with you today is ASEAN multilateral military cooperation as an element of stability. As we know that ASEAN is a vast continent and the most crowded population, and it is located in the significant strategic regions of the world. It includes various important sectors such as politics, economy, and military. So it is attracted by the international community for the changes in the region. The underlying reason that this region contains a density of population, rich natural resources, the center of stabilization and growth of the world economy. Now, the future, however, this region remains a variety of the conflicts and including territory, economy interests, and development conflicts between and among countries in the region. This region is also a place for collective and competitive weapons and arms. In some countries, it is risky to reach military conflicts. Many countries in this region are powerful in terms of military strength, robots that are more attractive for other power countries in the world. Besides, there is period consequences stemming from the war, such as unexploded onions from Indochina War, threats of terrorism, natural resources, drugs, and so on, which are the serious challenges. As the reason mentioned above, all countries in the ASEAN and Asia-Pacific are requested to establish suitable mechanisms in order to promote cooperation, understanding, trust, and confidence on each other more and more, which leads to the maintained peace, stability, and security in the region and the world as a whole. Therefore, associations of Southeast Asian nations, or ASEAN, has been established, and cooperative mechanism has been created, such as ASEAN Economic Community, ASEAN Socio and Cultural Community, and Defense Cooperative Mechanism, or ASEAN Political Security Community has been also created through the meeting, such as first, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, or ADMM. Second, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, or ADMM Plus. ASEAN Regional Forum, AIF, and ASEAN Chiefs of Defense Force Meeting, or ACDFM. Through all the meetings, these are mechanisms to strengthen good relations, constructive cooperation, and understanding mutual of ASEAN member states and among and between ASEAN member states with plus country and ASEAN partners in the region. This aims to build capacity for ASEAN member states being able to deal with challenges, promote among understanding, maintain peace and security in the region, and also contribute to the building strong ASEAN community. Therefore, the mechanism of ASEAN defense and security cooperation mentioned above contribute to promoting trust and confidence in the region and and between ASEAN and plus countries in order to maintain stability and security in the region and the world. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, in relation to multilateral military cooperation, as I have mentioned, from 2017-2020, Lao People's Army and Armed Forces of Russian Federation are the co-chairs expert working group on humanitarian action. Under the frameworks of ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, the co-chairs between Laos and Russia will conduct the joint field training exercise, and with the co-chairs between Indonesians and Australian Armed Forces expert working group on peacekeeping operation, which will be organized in Indonesia in 2020. As the outcomes of that military cooperation now, the Armed Forces of Russian Federation has sent a team of humanitarian action to the Lao PDR to survey and clear the UXO remaining from the Indochina War and in the central parts of Laos in Borikamsai province, and the mission has successfully completed. And the demining team had just returned to Russia last month on 15th of March 2019. The initial outcome in 5-month operation, the mining team could discover 380 UXO, and all UXO were destroyed successfully. This accomplishment saw the successful cooperation in the terms of UXO clearance between Lao People armies and the Armed Forces of Russian Federation. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Lao PDR will continue to implement and promote its foreign policies of the peace, independence, friendship, cooperation, multi-cooperation, various forms of cooperation with neighboring countries and the country in the region and the world. Before concluding my presentation, I would like to emphasize that at that time we are facing the challenges and threats in the region. It requests all nations in our region to closely cooperate with each other, promote good relations with the countries that promote peace, good world progression based on equality, mutual interests, or overcome the challenges by solving the problem peacefully. Lao PDR would like to express our congratulations on the efforts and main organizer of Russian Federation conducting this conference, which is an important platform and which this conference concludes with a successful outcome. Lao PDR is ready to implement and contribute to the building mutual understanding and confidence with ASEAN member states and other countries in the region and the world. Lao PDR supports all mechanisms and attempts of the communities in the region and the world regarding regional peace and security maintenance in order to encourage the develop together. Taking this opportunity, I would like to wish the armed forces and the people of Russian Federation success and prosperity in the building and developing their own countries. Wish this conference concludes with successful outcome. Thank you.
This conference will definitely be a success because we have such great speakers talking about such important topics. I would like to apologize to the minister because I had a mistake. I demoted him. He is actually Army General, and I apologize for that. And our colleague from Laos attracted our attention to a very important topic. The topic of relatively smaller countries being able still to contribute to international security through essentially international cooperation. And there is an expression in English which we don't have an equivalent of in Russian, the last but not least, which means the last in order but not least in importance. And it is great pleasure for me to invite to the podium our guest from Africa. We hadn't yet talked about Africa, but Africa is extremely important for today's world. The Minister of National Defense and Army Restoration, Ms. Marie-Noëlle Koira, from the Central African Republic. I would like to welcome all of the participants of the conference on behalf of my delegation, on behalf of my country, and my own behalf. I would like to thank the Minister of Defense of Russia for the invitation extended to my country to take part in this exchange of opinions on issues of security and stability in the world. This is the topic that is of interest to us, especially given that my country now really needs both peace and security. Let me dwell on what country I represent. What is the Central African Republic? My country is in the dead center of the African continent. Our square area is 625,000 square kilometers, and the population is about 5 million people. It's a very resources-rich country. We have a lot of natural resources, mineral deposits, and we focused our development on developing livestock farming and agriculture. Unfortunately, our reforms have not been adopted to our realities, and that pushed our country towards active utilization of mineral resources. As soon as our country adopted this course of development, crisis erupted. There was a whole string of crises that really tore our country apart, and that led to the most important crisis in our history in 2012. I'm talking about a crisis that led to a lot of casualties, a lot of people who lost their lives. Many women got killed, many religious actors died. You probably remember that picture. The woman carries her stuff on her head, not knowing where to go. Children that lost connection with their parents had to become members of militant groups. And I told you that we had previously been concentrated more on agriculture and livestock breeding. Unfortunately, during that crisis, the shepherds that were supposed to herd our livestock were supposed to carry not just a stick or a cane, but to carry weapons, because even doing that required them to be armed. So a shepherd with a firearm is now a picture of the day. So I'd like to reiterate that if you are an agricultural country, security is of primary importance. During the crisis of 2012, our armed forces were slapped with an embargo. And that's why you understand why our ministry is called the Ministry of National Defense and Army Restoration, Army Reform. We are restoring our armed forces. During our period after the crisis, we started training programs for our armed forces. Unfortunately, we do realize that an army cannot perform its functions without proper armaments and arms and weapons. And to get to peace, we need to have a properly equipped army. Our president, the president of our republic, spoke to many actors, but we couldn't get the necessary equipment and weapons. The only country that didn't say no to us was the Russian Federation. That helped us with the equipment for 4 battalions of Central African Republic's armed forces. Every time we go to international conferences, the very first question we hear is, what is the basis of this cooperation between the Central African Republic and Russia? I wish they had asked us about how our people lived that were living through a crisis. That's something that should worry them. And rather than asking us about what's the basis for our cooperation with Russia, I think this is a question that does make sense. Russia is one of our main partners. Since 1963, it has been the case. The topic that causes concerns for us, well, actually there are several of them, multiple topics, worry us. Since the beginning of the crisis, we noted 2 trends. The very first one of them is that livestock farmers that could have their herds, roam freely, now they have to defend themselves and defend their livestock. These people come from different countries. They have different origins. The other thing that you have to keep in mind when you analyze the outcome of the crisis, you have to understand how those militant groups act. They attack villages, they kill religious leaders, they put houses on fire, and among those militant groups are a lot of foreigners who came from neighboring countries. When you analyze what they do in our country, you don't have a doubt that we have terrorist organizations that are active in our country. But being in the very center of Africa, our country doesn't have a strong enough army to control its borders. It's a country that's going through a profound reform and is going through the process of restoring its army. What can we do to terrorists that come to us? We are limited in what we can do, and these militant groups can then propagate their influence on all of the neighboring areas. That causes us a great deal of concern. And when we see how those terrorists act on our land, how they act in Mali and Burkina Faso, we can say that dozens of people get killed, that they lose their lives every day. These terrorists that essentially flock into groups, they want to be one step ahead of us. You just listen to our colleague from Congo-Brazzaville. He spoke about the importance of the regional institutions. He spoke about the tools that can be used to achieve peace on the regional scale, and we believe that this tool for achieving peace in the region should continue being developed so that these countries, neighboring countries, could have tools to help each other and counteract these attacks. We mentioned Boko Haram, the terrorist group that is active in the Central African area, and if we could win them or win over them, it's only because Cameroon, Chad, and Nigeria joined their forces to be winners in this fight against Boko Haram terrorists. Of course, external help really helped strengthening us. We believe that this is an example that should be followed and it should be scaled up. We will be developing our system of observers so that we could be ahead of the terrorists, one step ahead of them. They have their own networks, the terrorists, and our country needs a system of monitoring that would allow us to control our territory, and we should do this in partnership with our neighbors, because it is hard for us to stand against these attacks on our own, and I think that's something that should bring us together, and that's a general concern. No one is guaranteed from this, is immune from this on the world scale, and I would like to use this opportunity to appeal to you all, to call upon us all, those of us who are concerned with the need of preserving peace and stability and security in the world. We need to extend our hands to each other, help each other, to make sure that we can restore peace and security when half, or at least a part of the world, is emblazoned, or rather is ablaze with conflict. We cannot stand aside. And essentially, we would welcome any help with the restoration of our national armed forces that would then be able to protect the people and preserve our borders. I would really be invaluable. And I'd like to talk to all of those present here that we are now trying to develop international cooperation on sub-regional level to make sure that these local unions could have the ability to counter these terrorist attacks. And before I complete and conclude my presentation, I would like to extend my words of condolences to all victims of terrorism around the entire world. And the recent attacks in Sri Lanka, specifically the ones that really shocked us. A lot of people died. We mourn for them, but we want to become more effective. We want to be more cohesive, and we want to be working together. And if we do this on international scales, we can turn things in the right direction and overcome. And that completes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your very passionate and very interesting presentation. That is something that is appropriate for the concluding presentation of the plenary session. And I would like to conclude by a statement that may sound a little bit surprising. Similar to Mr. Fomin, who is about to adjourn the conference, I'd like to say that I am a philologist by my first education. I was studying languages. And as I was sitting at this session, I was really happy that we could hear almost all major languages, world languages today: Chinese, French, English, Spanish, Russian, of course, and two great languages from Asia, from Korea and Laos. And I think that's what makes our approach very, and we heard, of course, other languages at other sessions. So what China's Minister of Defense, Mr. Wei Fenghe, said in the beginning concerned the balance and multicolored type of approach. I think it's very appropriate that we follow this approach. I'm not an organizer of the conference. I was invited to be a moderator, but I'm convinced that next year the conference of the Ministry of Defense is going to be even more multicolored and more balanced. And I'd like to thank all of the participants of this panel, and to you, dear distinguished guests, for listening to us. Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Colonel General Alexander Fomin.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, Colonel General Alexander Fomin.
Dear friends, unfortunately, to my great chagrin, this 8th Moscow Conference on International Security is coming to an end. We spent at least 3 days of productive meetings and discussions. And during these meetings, we discussed the most acute regional global issues of security in today's world. We looked at the current situation, we looked at the outlook, how things are going to unfold in the Middle East, and how Syria needs to be restored, how Iraq needs to be restored, how refugees need to be returned. We also looked at what is the threat of terrorism moving to other areas. In addition to this, many participants of the conference did an expert review of various aspects of security in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America regions, and a lot of attention was spent on anti-missile defense and militarization of space. Many countries spoke about their experience in the area of military cooperation and peacekeeping. We discussed existing problems that exist in that field. The discussions were open, transparent, and acute. We also talked about new types of conflicts, such as hybrid wars. And I would like to thank all of those who spoke at the plenary sessions and the special sessions for their professional analysis and their impartial assessment of the processes that are taking place in international politics about the challenges and threats that exist in global security. Roundtables that took place for the first time as part of the business program of the forum allowed us, in the course of those open discussions, to have a deeper look at the issues of war and peace. This is the topic of the Moscow conference. I would like to thank all of the participants and representatives of defense agencies, experts, and political scientists for their active support of the new format for the constructive exchange of opinion. And also I'd like to thank the mass media for their very impartial coverage of this event. And we will definitely issue a set of publications that will contain the proceedings of this conference. And in conclusion, I would like to say that this year more than 1,000 delegates from 111 countries took part in the conference, representing 7 international organizations as well. 77 official delegations arrived in Moscow. 55 countries sent us their delegations that represent the highest level of the ministries of defense and other heads of military agencies or their deputies, heads of general staff. These numbers are a testimony of the fact that this kind of platform is really in demand in today's situation, because we now really acutely feel the deficit for the dialogue between defense agencies. International security really depends on the level of trust between countries, and the only way to what trust is a dialogue. Some of the countries that we invited to participate in the country, unfortunately, did not send their representatives by showing their lack of readiness to maintain dialogue. This is one of the factors that constrains us in our search for mutually acceptable solutions that everyone is now interested in, from politicians to the military staff. We are really thankful to the high representatives of the United Nations organization, the OCTO and CSTO and the SCO organizations, the Commonwealth of Independent States and OECD, the International Red Cross Committee and the League of Arab States. And we thank them for their very fruitful contribution to the discussions on issues of international security. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude the 8th International Conference on International Security, I'd like to thank all of the participants for their contribution. And I would also like to thank the organizers of the forum, our interpreters included, and we just discussed it between ourselves that indeed our today's event, the 8th Moscow Conference on International Security, used many languages, and we had simultaneous interpretation with very good quality. We would like to thank our interpreters for that, the linguists that helped us with that. We would also like to thank the security service and the Radisson Hotel staff for being so disciplined and so effective. I would like to wish you all the best of success, prosperity, happiness, health to you, your families, to your countries, and to your militaries. We are saying goodbye, but only until the next conference. Thank you very much.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, на этом конференция заканчивается.
In your headphones.